STAAR Part 6. This, of course, is the STAAR PowerPoint presentation, which covers Chapter 10 of Jarrett, dealing with the Great Depression. And this will be our sixth and final part. So let us move forward. So the Great Migration. This is something that has been a topic we have discussed several times previously. And we have over here some images in the bottom right-hand corner. It looks like a black family all packed up as they made their way northward. And then, of course, you can see some images here of that actual movement northward. And then at the top of the page, it's a little bit difficult to read, a little bit difficult to see, but you have people all right in here who are heading off to different localities, different cities. Chicago right there, New York right there, and St. Louis right there. And so this all depicts the Great Migration. All right. During the 1920s, many African Americans began to move out of the South, away from farming, away from sharecropping, to what they refer to as the promised land of the northern cities. Farming has never really been a very profitable livelihood, unless, of course, you are the landowner. But even then, farming does have issues in terms of outside influences, the weather. Too much rain, too little rain, you got hurricane, you got tornadoes, an early freeze. All those things can cause problems with farming, which make it less than profitable. And since blacks rarely owned land and only worked on the land, the ability that they had to acquire wealth, to make money, was really almost non-existent. So, African Americans moving out of the South toward the promised land, which are the northern cities. We refer to that movement as the Great Migration. They, African Americans, left in search of jobs in the industrial cities and to escape sharecropping, tenant farming, and of course the racism you find in the South. So reasons why blacks left the South and moved northward was looking for jobs, escape sharecropping, tenant farming, and of course the racism that is synonymous with the South of that period of time. It changed the culture of these northern cities, especially Harlem, which is a section of New York City. But New York was not the only city that was affected. All the major industrialized cities in the north and in around the New England and Great Lakes area were affected by this Great Migration. So the Great Migration, did it affect New York greatly? Yes, and particularly, of course, the section known as Harlem. But every major city was affected to one extent or another. Let's move on to our next slide. Continuing with the Harlem Renaissance. Now, unfortunately, I do not have, this is not a copy of this is a copy, not the original. And so down here in the bottom right, there's supposed to be a little bit of a clip from Cab Calloway at the Cotton Club. I think I've already shown you some of that. So no matter what we do, this is not going to work. So sorry about that. We do have the Jazz Age, and here's a little bit of a picture. I think this is also seen in another slide. Here you have the really nice, expensive car, the people that are dressed in their finest clothes that are heading outward. The 1920s, going to our first bullet under the Harlem Renaissance. The first bullet, the 1920s, also is often called the Jazz Age, because the importance of the new musical form that African Americans created, the African American music known as jazz, hence the Jazz Age. And so the rebirth of interest in African American culture became known as the Harlem Renaissance. Harlem, well, why? Because it is a predominantly black area in New York, and this is where the cultural growth, or the growth of African American culture, particularly in the arts, took place. Now, again, it did happen in places like Philadelphia, Boston, Chicago, even on the West Coast. But the people who came from New York, the people who went to New York to perform, were probably the best known of the black entertainers of the day. And so Harlem is given a great deal of credit. And so hence we call it the Harlem Renaissance. The Renaissance was more than just about the music. It included dance, the visual arts, literature, poetry. So we often think of the Jazz Age, again, the Jazz Age right here, but the Jazz Age and the Harlem Renaissance, let me rephrase that, the Harlem Renaissance is more than about music. It included the dance, the visual arts, painting, sculpting, literature, and poetry. Literature, of course, that could be works of fiction, it could be biographies, it didn't really matter what it was, and of course poetry. All of those, music, dance, visual arts, literature, and poetry, made up or helped contribute to Harlem Renaissance. Let's move to our next slide, and here we have some examples of some of the people who took place or whose work is part of the Harlem Renaissance. Let's take a look at each one. First off, we have Langston Hughes, a writer/poet who expresses pride in heritage as well as attacking racism. Now, all three of these individuals were mentioned in the vocabulary terms, but what we have here are, number one, looks at each one of them, and here is a look at Langston Hughes, and then, of course, a little bit of their work. So, Hughes, writer-poet, expressed pride in his own heritage as a black man, as an African-American man, and attacked racism. There's a picture of him, and here is a little bit of a poem entitled, get that out of the way, there we go, entitled Harlem. What happens to a dream deferred? Does it dry up like a raisin in the sun, or fester like a sore and then run? Does it stink like rotten meat, or crust and sugar over like syrupy sweet? Maybe it just sags like a heavy load, or does it explode? I'm not much into poetry, but I can see where he is coming from. He's talking about the dream, the American dream. Does it dry up? Does it fester? Does it stink? Maybe it just sags. Maybe it just explodes. And of course, African Americans often found that chasing and then achieving the American dream was kind of difficult. Chasing is one thing, actually catching it is something else. And I think that is what this poem is referring to. Cullen and County, which is probably the wrong pronunciation, Cullen won more literary awards than any other African American writer. And there is a look right there and an example of the work by Cullen. For we must be one thing or the other, an asset or a liability, the sinew in your wing to help you soar, or the chain to bind you to earth. Again, we're talking about sort of the same stuff we saw with Langston Hughes, and you must be one or the other, either an asset helping you or something that hurts you, something that holds you back. Zora Neale Hurston, Zora Neale Hurston, one of the first successful African American female writers. Her greatest novel, Their Eyes Watching God. And there is a picture of her. And it's difficult to read. Let me read a little bit of what is attributed to her. Sometimes I feel discriminated against, but it does not make me angry. It merely astonishes me. How can one deny themselves the pleasure of my company? And then the rest, then at the end of it, it's beyond me. A bit difficult to see that last line there. And so that is an example of Miss Hurston's work. And this is a part of the Harlem Renaissance. These are some of the writers of some of the writers during the Harlem Renaissance: Hughes, Cullen, and Hurston. Let us move forward. And I believe we've already seen and heard some of the music of the Harlem Renaissance. We'll probably see some more of that. See some individuals like Louis Armstrong, and hear some of the music before we're finished this chapter. The Back to Africa movement, this was started by Marcus Garvey, and here's a picture of Garvey right here. And Garvey was a controversial figure. He was a political activist known for his fiery speeches and his fancy uniforms. And I think we can see, a little bit of the fanciness right there. Okay. Garvey formed what he called the Universal Negro Improvement League that had a its goal was total liberation of African people around the world. You got to keep in mind, in the period of time we're looking at, the 1920s, a good chunk of Africa had been colonized by Europeans. The English, the French, the Dutch, the Germans, so forth and so on. And many people believe that some of the problems that exist in those countries to this day, the problems that exist on the African continent today, is attributed to the colonization of European countries in Africa. Now, whether this is true or not is not something we're going to get into at this moment. But there are people who believe that all the problems of poverty and war, genocide, is a result of that colonization some 100 years, 90 years before. And so what Garvey was attempting to do was, through the Universal Negro Improvement League, was to liberate African people around the world, not just here in America, but also still in Africa. There was a great deal of disillusionment with those who had participated in the Great Migration. Those who had migrated to the North found that their life was not a lot better. Was it better? Yeah, it was to some extent. Was it what they had hoped it to be? Probably not. The frustration of coping with urban life and the racism that followed many African Americans set the stage for his Back to Africa movement. Slavery was primarily found in the South. That was ended, of course, with the end of the Civil War in 1865 and the passage of the 13th Amendment the same year. Racism toward blacks was not confined to the South. There were racists in the North. The North appeared to be a little bit more covert, hidden about its racism toward blacks, as opposed to the overt, open racism toward blacks in the South. So the North was more covert, the South more overt. But there still was racism. And of course you had urban life, which is difficult under the best circumstances. You add that to racism, and many African Americans saw, hey, Back to Africa movement, that sounds pretty good. Now, here in the middle of the page on the right side, if we as a people realize the greatness from which we came, we'd be less likely to disrespect ourselves. And I believe that is a quote directly from Marcus Garvey. If we as a people realize the greatness from which we came, we'd be less likely to disrespect ourselves, whether it be the way they behave or how they groveled before the white man, how they worked for less money, or whatever the case may be. And in the bottom is a part of a paper, The Negro World, title, Africa, the Land of Hope and Promise for Negro Peoples of the World. And I realize some of that is a little bit difficult to see because of the little Doceri desktop trial image down there. And so Marcus Garvey attempted to repatriate, to return American Africans, people who were descended from Africa in America, back to Africa. And unfortunately for him and them, it did not work well. We discussed the failures of Marcus Garvey previously. He was arrested for embezzlement. His cruise line, the Black Star, it was a cruise ship line. He embezzled money from it. He was arrested, convicted, and then deported. He originally was from Jamaica. He was deported back to Jamaica, and the whole Back to Africa movement sort of fizzled and faded away. Popular new heroes of the period of time. Now, again, I don't have the videos to go with this. We have looked at, and we will look at some Charlie Chaplin stuff. and we'll look at some other things as well. But our first bullet, in the 1920s, we saw people have more leisure time and a greater opportunity for entertainment. We are in the middle of the 40-hour work week that was instituted. We have people being paid more money, working less hours than ever before, thanks in part to Ford and the Ford Motor Company. He paid his workers more and more money than ever before, with the hope of they could now afford to buy a car. And in addition to that, they could buy other goods, which would help the economy. And so people are working less, 40 hours a week, making more money than ever before. They had a lot of free time. They had a lot of leisure time. And they were looking for ways to entertain themselves because of that free time and money in their pockets. The American public embraced spectator sports, radio, movies, and magazines. And we're going to take a look at, if we have not already done so, some of the sports and movie heroes of the day. And time permitting, we have looked at, or will look at, or listen to, probably a better way to phrase it, some of the radio of the day. And of course, the music that I've already played for you is the music that you'd hear on the radio. So we may not do that, but we will take a look at some of the sports heroes and some of the entertainment movie heroes, movie personalities of the day. On the radio, people turned in to hear drama, crime, and mystery stories. And of course, just music. Charlie Chaplin, and I believe I've already shown you some of his work, was one of the early, if not the first really big early movie star. Let's move to our next one. Charles Lindbergh. Here's a picture. Charles Lindbergh, often referred to as Lucky Lindy. Lindy being an abbreviation of his last name, Lindbergh. Anyway, here is a look at the Spirit of St. Louis. It is a plane. It is hanging in the Smithsonian. Charles Lindbergh, in the 1920s, attempted to win a $25,000 award for being the first person to fly across the Atlantic Ocean and to deliver the mail. He was the first to fly nonstop solo across the Atlantic. And of course, that began in May of 1927. The first person to fly solo across the Atlantic. Because of that, he became a national hero, and his flight opened the door for commercial flights between America and Europe. So now, I mean, again, look at the plane that he's flying there, and I think we've already seen a few images of this in at least one of the videos I've shown you. Because of his achievement, he proved it could be done. I think most people believe that it could be done, but he was the first one to do it. For that, he was recognized as a national hero, and it paved the way for commercial flights to carry mail, to carry goods, to carry people across the Atlantic, making the passage from America to Europe or vice versa quicker, more easy. Now, again, I cannot show you Babe Ruth. I'm sorry, wrong one. There we go. Babe Ruth or Jack Dempsey. Here is a picture of Ruth. Here's a picture of Dempsey. Ruth, of course, is arguably, even to this day, the greatest baseball player of all time. In fact, I say he is, so he is. And then, of course, Dempsey was the dominant boxer, heavyweight boxer of his time. And these are just two of the sports heroes of the 1920s who became legendary. Babe Ruth, Jack Dempsey. I will show you some stuff on Ruth, or I should have already have. I probably already have. I'm not sure about Dempsey. If time permits, I'll show you some on him, but Ruth, definitely we will take a look at. Let's move forward. And this should be our last slide. Yes, it is. Our last slide of the presentation. And we are looking at a summary of the 1920s, of the Roaring '20s, of the Jazz Age. The 1920s were a time of great excitement, rapid changes that ended with a crash. And of course, the crash refers to the stock market crash of 1929. The 20s started slowly, but grew into a period of great prosperity. A majority of Americans prospered in the 20s, not all. For a short time, farmers did in the early 20s, and then as overproduction and competition for European markets grew, so did, well, as overproduction and competition for markets grew, the profits made by farmers fell. In fact, farmers were really the largest group that did not prosper during the 1920s. Women, blacks, two groups that had predominantly been left out of American history, economically speaking, did prosper. Not all of them, but a majority of them did. A fear of communism, immigrants, alcohol helped create feelings of mistrust, hatred, and unlawfulness. Communism brought about the Red Scare, the fear of communism. The fear of immigration brought about changes in immigration laws, with 3 laws passed to limit the immigrants from certain countries. Those new immigrants from the south and eastern part of Europe. And of course, alcohol, the fear of alcohol led to prohibition, which created all kinds of problems. The rise of organized crime, for example. Women's suffrage, flappers, Ford cars, Harlem Renaissance, and new technologies made the 20s an exciting time to live. Women gained the right to vote, the universal suffrage in 1920, thanks to the 19th Amendment. Flappers, young women changing the culture of women in America, changing the culture through new styles of dress, shorter skirts, new hairstyles, dancing, drinking, smoking in public. Ford revolutionized the industrial world through mass production, the creating, the building of cars. And again, it doesn't really matter what we are talking about, but we're talking about Ford cars, mass producing cars to the point where they were producing a new car every 10 seconds. That made cars more affordable. Because of the large supply of cars being produced, he could charge less, making it more affordable to most Americans. Harlem Renaissance brought about a deeper, new and deep appreciation of black artists, whether they be musicians, singers, dancers, painters, sculptors, writers. The technologies, there's so many of them that creates this exciting time. Motion pictures, the radio, the industrialization of America, the electrification of America. All of those created jobs, created wealth, and made life not only exciting, but more pleasurable. Again, keep in mind, you can now drive a car. You could buy and drive a car to Harlem to watch black musicians. You could take with you a young woman dressing like a flapper after she had just voted. I mean, come on, what is there not to like? Finally, the 20s roared until the stock market crashed because of over-speculation, because of buying on margin, because of unsound business practices, which we will take up in greater depth in the next chapter. All these events, all of these events led to, helped contribute to the Great Depression, which is what we'll take up in the next chapter. Okay, we have finished our final STAAR presentation. This is a STAAR PowerPoint, and this was part 6. We're done.